And now an update on today's top stories. I'm Lewis Waters. A pensioner who went missing on Wednesday has been found safe and well. 88-year-old Margaret Greenhoff, who suffers from dementia, went missing from her home in Morris Green Lane in Greater Leather, Bolton. Concerned police officers earlier issued an alert saying they were worried for her welfare. A £300,000 electrical upgrade in Earlham has taken place this week. The project will upgrade the energy supply to around 9,000 businesses and residents. The Swinton subway near Moorside High School is now refurbished. A sound system and colourful new tiling has been brought to create a more pleasant environment and safer environment in the subway. The Lexicon of Love by ABC will be taken out following the 30th anniversary concert last year in London. The performance will take place on Saturday evening at the Lowry, Salford Quays. ABS will be accompanied by Southbank Symphonia and conducted by musician and composer Anne Dudley. Manchester has seen a substantial increase in people cycling to work. The number of those contributing by bike almost doubled in 10 years, data from the latest 2011 census reveals. Between 2011 and 2011, residents across the country were twice as likely to cycle to work if they lived in urban areas as opposed to a rural one. Manchester United.
Obviously, I feel better about cycling as I can park my bike wherever I want because it's got public areas. But in the winter, the weather puts me off it, so I decide to get public transport like the buses or the tram, for example, and just walk the rest.
Yeah, I use my bike less than I did 10 years ago. There's a number of reasons for that. But the main one is I think it's really dangerous for cyclists on the roads these days. I don't think car drivers are very considerate, and I've had lots of close shaves with cars pulling out in front of me. It just makes me very cautious about using my bike a lot.
Yeah, I use the bike now to go to work and to go home. Because where I work for, pay for the bike to get you out your cars on your bike, get yourself fit and better for the environment and things like that.
Manchester United have rubbished claims that the Glazers are set to sell the club. The Glazers had a 90% stake in the club, have owned the club for 9 years now, with the season arguably being the worst of their tenure. They have been rumoured to sell the club due to a loss of interest to David Beckham and the class of '92. Scientists say they have new evidence that autism begins in the womb. Changes in the developing brain long before birth may cause symptoms of autism spectrum disorder, according to new research. Field Marshal Abdul Fattah al-Sisi has announced he has resigned as Egypt's military chief in order to stand for presidency. The Marshal led the overthrow of Islamist President Mohamed Morsi in July after mass opposition protests. Correspondents say he is likely to win the presidency given his popularity and the lack of any serious rivals. Switzerland will host the first Bionic Olympics in 2016. Competitors who are paralysed from the neck down will control an avatar using brain interface and will be called pilots instead of athletes. But both the winner and the competition and the company who designed the device will walk away with the medals. This gives those who have never been able to compete before an opportunity to enter the Olympics. And now, over to Helen with the weather.
This afternoon, the easterly weather front will bring rain for most of the country, but it should be a lot nicer for most of us for the weekend. Some of these showers will be heavy in the north and they could turn wintry over higher ground. The occasional heavy shower is expected with highs of 8 degrees for the capital. The south coast will see the best weather with sun throughout the day, but will feel a lot cooler in the wind. This evening, the rain should ease off with leaving occasional showers in the north, lows of 4 degrees. So now we're off to India, where the weather is a lot different to ours. There are no showers in sight across the country and temperatures in the high 30s. So I'll now pass over to the Asian College of Journalism in Chennai, where it is a very warm 35 degrees.
Hello and welcome to ACJ News India. I'm Rajita Menon.
And I'm Anshu Lal, and we're bringing you this show from the second most populous country in the world.
India is one of the two emerging Asian giants and the world's largest democracy. Its 29 states have all possible landscapes.
And the people are the ones who give India its character. India has such a vast variety of religions, cultures, traditions, and ethnicities that make it truly a remarkable nation.
And now, these people are in the process of selecting their leader for the next 5 years. India is approaching its 16th general elections and the country is caught up in frenzy. Which is why on today's show, we have a special election segment where we'll explain to you this large-scale democratic exercise. Let's take a look at the highlights of today's show.
The 2014 Indian elections are almost here. We will talk about the constitutional process of elections and the effort involved. India's voter base has increased by 1 million people. This makes it the world's biggest elections. We will also explain about different political parties and state politics.
More than half of India's population lives in rural areas. The benefits of the country's development do not always reach them. We bring stories from different states. And then we have special features on sports, heritage and culture, aspects that give India its distinct feel.
So that is the mix of topics that we have lined up for the show today. So what's the first topic that we should start with?
The same topic that the entire country has been talking about since the start of this year, the 2014 general elections. 814 million people are gearing up to vote. The huge size of this population makes it a challenge for the Election Commission to conduct the elections effectively. But then, India has always managed to do so year after year. The reason behind this is a well laid out election procedure. Our correspondent Jayant and I bring you the process.
The Indian Parliament has two houses, the Lok Sabha, the lower house, and Rajya Sabha, the upper house. Lok Sabha has 545 seats. Elections will be held to fill 543 of those seats. The remaining two are nominated by the country's president. Elections in India are held every 5 years. The country is split up into separate geographical areas known as constituencies. This is called delimitation of constituencies. After this, the voters' list of each constituency is prepared. Candidates who want to contest file nomination papers. The dates for filing nominations are decided by the Election Commission. A date is fixed for the scrutiny of all the nomination papers. If the nominees are found ineligible, they are rejected. Then starts the election campaign. A candidate can spend up to 25 lakh rupees for Lok Sabha campaign. The campaign stops 48 hours prior to voting. All the political parties in the country have to follow a model code of conduct for the election campaign. The elections are scheduled in different phases in different parts of the country. On the fixed date, voting takes place. For this, election booths are set up. Voters go to polling booths and cast their votes. Voting is held by secret ballot. These days, electronic voting machines are used to record votes. After voting, the machines are sealed and taken to counting centers. There, the votes are counted in the presence of the returning officer. Finally, the candidate with majority of votes becomes a member of parliament for that constituency. But if any candidate feels that the election has not been held properly, he can file an election petition in the court. If the objections raised are found to be correct, the court can set aside that election. In that constituency, the election will be held again. The party with majority in Lok Sabha forms the government.
It's amazing to see how this long process works out so easily. I mean, so many complicated and long things happening at the same time. But the problem is that many candidates do not stick to the rules put forward by the Election Commission. For example, I don't think that any political party sticks to the rule of the spending limit for the campaigns. And because of the existence of so many political parties, the Election Commission finds it tough to keep track of so many parties.
That's definitely true. We have a lot of political parties in India right now. Some are decades old, while some were formed as recently as a few weeks ago.
Today, there are a total number of 1,616 registered political parties in India. Because of the existence of such a huge number of political parties, the main theme of politics that's followed in India is that of the coalition.
In India, the first ever coalition government at the national level was formed in 1977. As the election date approaches, major parties are in talks with regional players to get support for themselves. Our correspondent Himani talks about the different political parties, their leaders, and the different ideologies they represent. At the other side, we have the election desk in discussion with senior journalist A.S. Paneerselvam.
The longest elections in India's history is scheduled to begin from 7th of April, extending till May 12th. For the first time, it has been divided into 9 phases. It will be held on 9 different days in different constituencies of different states for 543 parliamentary seats. In India, central government is formed through Lok Sabha elections and state government is formed through legislative assembly elections. Centre-left ruling party Indian National Congress and the biggest opposition, right-wing Hindu nationalist Bharatiya Janata Party, have been arch rivals since BJP's formation in 1989. However, it has been difficult for both the parties to win without gaining allies. They need the support of other national and regional parties to make their way to the centre. BJP leads National Democratic Alliance, whereas Congress leads United Progressive Alliance. As of now, a fringe party from Bihar, a few regional parties from Tamil Nadu, and the main opposition party from Maharashtra have aligned with the NDA. The Congress has not been able to align with many major political parties other than hearing a word from a regional party of Bihar. Amidst the rivalry between UPA and NDA, Indian political panorama has a new entry called the Aam Aadmi Party, led by Arvind Kejriwal, who led a campaign against corruption in 2013. The party has gained popularity in a short span of time. He became the CM of Delhi in December 2013 and resigned in February because of a political controversy. It is interesting how in some states of the country, regional parties have more influence than national parties. For instance, in Tamil Nadu, AIADMK has more influence than BJP or Congress. Amidst the ultimate rivalry and their respective allies, there may emerge the third front, wherein 14 regional and political parties have decided to come together to provide a political alternative. Nevertheless, all these speculations will only get a face after elections are over. Evidently, India is a country which has been able to accommodate scores of political parties with different ideologies and agendas, which makes it world's largest democracy and this year's elections all the more interesting.
Hello and welcome. I'm Siddhanath Ganu.
I'm Akshanath.
2014, the biggest event is the 16th Lok Sabha elections. The entire country has been waiting for this event for the past 2 years. The political parties have fielded their candidates. The workers are in the field burning the midnight oil.
We have with us Mr. A.S. Paneerselvam, political journalist and reader's editor of The Hindu, with us to discuss more on the state elections. Hello, sir. Welcome to the show. Hello. Sir, actually, we are seeing that there's a change in the trend in which the political parties are moving around in the country right now. So what do you think is the status? The set equations are being moved and there might be a change, a drastic change. What is your take on this, sir?
See, one thing is certain, that is Dr. Manmohan Singh is not going to be the next Prime Minister. Apart from that, every other possibility is a possible one. Therefore, you talk to any political leader, they come up with 4 or 5 scenarios. Scenario A, Scenario B, Scenario C and Scenario D. And they also talk about Scenario A with a C variation or Scenario B with D variation. So it's very difficult to take a concrete idea about what is going to be the outcome of this election.
So recently in Andhra Pradesh, the Election Commission conducted certain raids in the campaign that has been going on, in which they confiscated a lot of money which was allegedly taken for electoral expenses and something like that. And this is not a new scenario before elections. Every time there are allegations of money being spent and illegally distributed and things like that. In such a condition, how do you see the responsibility of the Election Commission handling these kind of things?
See, beyond a point, Election Commission can only act as a agency to prevent these things, but the onus is also on the political parties and the onus is also on the electorate. As long as the electorate are going to take money, the political parties are going to give money. Therefore, we can't expect the Election Commission to do anything beyond this, because structurally there are certain limitations. And also in certain states what we know is that the money was distributed even before the model code of conduct was implemented. Now are we going to exclude those things from the electoral process? So it's a difficult question, but the good thing is that from 1952, if you look at the outcome of the elections, essentially the outcome reflected the will of the people, despite malpractices, despite any number of allegations about money power.
So the responsibility lies on both sides of the spectrum.
Yes, both of the political parties as well as of the electorate.
Right.
So now we'll have a look at the Election Commission and the various aspects, the new aspects they've been trying to introduce. So our correspondents Sindhu Hariharan and Neha Gupta bring you more on the story.
The Election Commission of India is a permanent constitutional body responsible for facilitating the electoral processes in India. The Commission came into existence on 25th of January 1950, which is celebrated as the National Voters' Day. It directs, controls and supervises the elections to the Parliament of India, to the state legislatures and also to the office of the President and Vice President of India. The Chief Election Commissioner is the head of the Commission and is appointed by the President of India. The current Chief Election Commissioner of India is Veeravalli Sundaram Sampath. A major responsibility of the Commission is to ensure free and fair elections. A tool that it uses for this is the Model Code of Conduct. The Commission issued this code for the first time in 1971, which was the 5th election of the country, and it has been revising it since then. This lays down the guidelines for conduct of political parties and candidates during elections, and it remains in force till the end of the electoral process. The Commission is also credited with introducing critical electoral reforms on a regular basis. The notable ones among these are regulating the usage of state-owned media by political parties, checking the entry of those with criminal records in politics, and an option to cast a vote under the none of the above option. Recognizing the importance of voter participation in the success of democracy, the Commission also conducts voter awareness and education programs.
The 2014 general elections will see a new feature on the electronic voting machines or EVM. For the first time, voters in a national election will have the option of choosing nota or none of the above, also known as a scratch vote, designed to allow the voter to indicate disapproval of all the candidates in a voting system. The option of nota was first made available in the November-December assembly polls last year. This time, voter slips that guide people to polling stations will have photographs to check fake voting. The Election Commission will maintain a paper trail of the votes cast. This means that when voters enter their vote on the EVM, a piece of paper with the name and symbol of the party will briefly appear and fall into a box. In 2009, when the Election Commission of India had expressed a wish to the Supreme Court of India to offer the voter the option of nota, it was met with general disagreement. A public interest litigation statement was filed by the People's Union for Civil Liberties, a non-governmental organization, on 27 September last year. The Supreme Court, following that, ruled the right to register a none of the above vote in the elections. Nota differs drastically from RTR or the right to reject. Despite opposition from some political parties in Jammu and Kashmir, including the Congress, the Election Commission of India has decided to go ahead with the Nota option in the state for the upcoming Lok Sabha elections. The Lok Sabha elections will involve a staggering 814 million voters, an increase of some 100 million from 2009, and a sharp rise from the 176 million in the first parliamentary polls of 1952. Negative voting will lead to a systematic change in polls, and political parties will be forced to project clean candidates. If the right to vote is a statutory right, then the right to reject candidate is a fundamental right of speech and expression under the Constitution, said the bench headed by the Chief Justice of India, P. Sathasivam.
One of the prominent features of the 2014 elections is the number of new voters that are going to be enrolled in the electoral rolls. Sir, this is the first time that such a big bulge of youth voters will be voting in a general election. Will it have a big impact on the elections?
See, when Rajiv Gandhi reduced the voting age from 21 to 18, a lot of people thought that this is not going to have any major impact because the youth are losing interest in public affairs. And that cynical attitude gained currency because we did not see much of youth participation in the 91 elections or in the 96 elections. But from 98, we are seeing the increasing participation of the younger voters. And in the recently concluded Delhi Assembly election, Aam Aadmi Party's voting, nearly 40% of its vote came from the young voters, which means the young voters have started playing a much bigger role. And this idea of cynical opposition of this youth vote is not going to have any impact, they are not going to come to the polling booths, is no longer valid. The most interesting aspect of this youth vote is that they are not too ideologically aligned with one formation or the other. They seem to be much more fluid. And that fluidity is the one which makes the prediction difficult.
Even though there is a large youth voters list that have come up, there's still a large number of people who do not have the right to vote. Rajita Menon brings us more on this story.
Election after election, India's voter turnout remains low. This is because a huge part of the population is not able to vote. These are soldiers of the Indian Army. They are part of the armed forces along with Navy and Air Force. None of them are able to vote. They are mostly away from their constituencies. Even the state police is not able to vote. They have the most hectic schedules during election time. So do bodyguards of political leaders. Every year, nearly 25 lakh people working in the armed forces do not vote. Convicted prisoners cannot vote in India. Even under trials and those in police custody do not have this right. India has around 1,400 jails with almost 4 lakh inmates. More than half of them are under trials. There are 25 million Indians living abroad. The rule is that they have to be physically present in India on the day of voting, and they have to be present in their respective constituencies. They cannot vote through post or internet. India does not allow that. These people are migrant labourers. April to May is the time when most of them leave their places and seek work outside. They cannot afford to return to their constituencies just for the polls. There are around 15 million migrants in rural areas alone.
So what is the most striking feature of the upcoming 2014 elections?
The most interesting aspect of this election is that India is really becoming polyphonous. For people who are used to an idea of a straightforward, less complicated one, think that this is a fragmented polity. But what is actually happening is that it is a multinodal narrative where multiple aspirations are given a voice, and all these multiple aspirations are getting played out. Therefore, in a sense, we are seeing multiple aspirations getting played out on a very large canvas. So you are going to see various hues of political aspirations and political narratives getting played out. Therefore, this is going to be a very, very different election from all other elections, because anybody who can cross a margin of 10 seats is going to have a say in the way the next government is going to be formed.
So this will basically break the monotony that was created for the past two elections.
No, I don't think the last two elections were monotony. Last two elections are also part of this process of reconfiguration. From a very highly centralized national party-led polity towards multiple state party-led aspirations. It's a process. It started in 1996, and we are seeing in 2014 consolidation of the process which started in 1996.
Right. So it's a product. This election could be seen as a product of a process that went on for almost 10-15 years.
Yeah, about a 2-decade-long process getting consolidated. See, we have been always used to this idea of a national party leading the government. Right. What we tend to forget is twice the national parties had to provide outside support. We had Congress providing outside support to United Front government, and we had BJP providing outside support to VP Singh government. Therefore, that process is the one which is getting consolidated. Right. I will not be surprised to see one of the national parties again providing outside support this election also.
So we hope that this election lives up to the aspirations and expectations of the people of this country. Thank you so much for coming on the show, sir, today.
Really we have to now go for a small break, and on the other side of the break, you will have Rajita and Anshu with more.
This discussion really highlighted how important the elections are for India this time. I mean, even before the elections, we can see how big an impact the run-up to the elections are creating in Indian politics.
Definitely. And major changes are also being brought about by some important states like Uttar Pradesh. Uttar Pradesh has the largest number of constituencies in India. Also, Mr. Narendra Modi is contesting from Varanasi in Uttar Pradesh this time. Mr. Modi is the prime ministerial candidate of the Bharatiya Janata Party and a great favourite with the masses.
Winning in Uttar Pradesh definitely means winning a large chunk of the seats in the Lok Sabha. But winning in Uttar Pradesh is also a complicated task because the politics in Uttar Pradesh is based a lot on caste. Right now we have a story by Tvesh Mishra on the politics in the state of Uttar Pradesh, and after the story we will return to the election desk, which will hear the opinions of some of the people in Uttar Pradesh about the upcoming elections.
Uttar Pradesh, the largest stakeholder in the Indian Parliament, commands an impressive majority in the Lok Sabha. Despite having lost 5 of its seats to Uttaranchal during the succession, Uttar Pradesh still has 80 seats in the Lok Sabha and 31 of the 233 seats in the Rajya Sabha. The state can be divided into 4 major regions of Bundelkhand, Western Uttar Pradesh, Central, that is Awadh, and Eastern UP. Over the past 3 decades, the Indian National Congress has been struggling to regain foothold in the state. After the demolition of the Babri Masjid and the consolidation of Dalit votes under Kanshi Ram, the Congress party has been struggling to gain power. UP's politics is highly dominated by caste. The Bharatiya Janata Party rose to power after the 1992 demolition of the Babri Masjid and them consolidating a large upper caste vote bank. The Bahujan Samaj Party, on the other hand, focuses more on lower caste and Dalit votes alongside other backward caste or OBC votes. The Samajwadi Party, the ruling party in the state, focuses on other backward caste votes, on Yadav votes and on Muslim votes. Elections in Uttar Pradesh would be held in 6 phases. The first phase begins on 10th April and the last phase on 12th May. Industrialized districts like Ghaziabad and Gautam Budh Nagar in western UP would be going to polls in the first phase. The rise of caste-based parties in Uttar Pradesh has hurt the Congress the worst. The predominantly upper caste leadership of the Bharatiya Janata Party and the Congress party has not done much to woo the lower caste or the other backward caste vote banks in the state, thus leading to the rise of regional parties in national politics.
Uttar Pradesh has been the main battleground for most of the political parties in India, and this time it's no different. Most of the political parties have set their candidates in Uttar Pradesh. And this time, we have with us in our studio, Piyush Rai.
He is a correspondent with ACJ Newsline, and Piyush will be talking to us about the detailed aspects of Uttar Pradesh elections. Piyush, if we take a look at the state, Varanasi has become a kind of a flashpoint in the state. BJP has fielded its prime ministerial candidate Narendra Modi from there. Aam Aadmi Party's Arvind Kejriwal was planning to fight from there. And recently there was a news that Congress might field Digvijay Singh, another big political leader from the same constituency. Varanasi has been a very special seat in the state. What impact will this political race have on the larger elections in the state?
Varanasi has been actually a BJP bastion for long. Murli Manohar Joshi won it for BJP in 2009. And Modi, for Narendra Modi, it was the most secure seat where he could have very easily, convincingly won in Uttar Pradesh. For Aam Aadmi Party's Arvind Kejriwal, it's a kind of done deal, as in even it's a win-win situation for him. Even if he loses, he's contesting against Narendra Modi, the face of the party, BJP, and actually the face of the nation right now.
So you think more than winning, he's trying to make it a prestige point?
Arvind Kejriwal?
Yeah.
See, contesting against Narendra Modi, even if he loses, he gets the sentiments of the citizens out there. Okay, he is recently in Varanasi and he's campaigning. So I guess it will be very difficult for Arvind Kejriwal to make a difference. As in he'll be very much able to cut down votes for Modi out there, but to make a large impact out there in terms of electoral margins and all. Yeah. I guess he'll not be capable for that in 2014 elections due May.
But isn't BJP just trying to mobilize the Hindu crowd there through Modi's stand there?
So I've already told you that Varanasi was a BJP bastion, as in Murli Manohar Joshi was already winning it for BJP since years. So it won't make any big difference. It just wanted that Modi should win convincingly from there, and it just wanted to actually make a statement from there that this person can win from Gujarat, can win from Uttar Pradesh. So Uttar Pradesh has 80 Lok Sabha constituencies. So this is the only state that can actually make a big difference if any party goes for a majority out there, winning more than a 40 seat out there. That party is gonna go for the center.
Let's come to the parties that emanate from Uttar Pradesh itself. Samajwadi Party is ruling the state right now, and in these upcoming Lok Sabha elections, do you think Samajwadi Party will continue its streak?
See, in Uttar Pradesh, it's always a four-cornered match. Four-cornered match as in SP, Samajwadi Party, BSP, Bahujan Samajwadi Party, BJP and Congress. So when it comes to the vote share in the state, the very critical thing is that it's almost a very equal vote share. As in in the last elections, BSP was the majority one that gained the most from there. It was only 23% of the 23 seats. Then followed by BJP that won 20 seats, then 15, and then last was the Congress. So any party making a difference from UP has to win at least more than 30 seats so that it has a say in the government, that the alliance government that is formed in the center. So that has not been there. With almost 80 Lok Sabha constituency seats, Uttar Pradesh has not been that a big player in Lok Sabha elections.
Since Samajwadi Party is the ruling party in the state right now, it's important to look at its prospectus in the coming elections. To know more about SERPA's prospectus in the upcoming elections, we spoke to Mr. Ravi Arora,
Regional Editor, Governance Now.
Yeah, and let's hear out what he had to say about the party.
I think Samajwadi Party will not take more. They will try to
leaders
the Dalit voters and the OBC voters, they are already aligned for SP and BSP respectively. So they have to bank upon minority votes only. But the problem is that there is only 18, the whole electoral population of Varanasi contains only 18.5% of minority votes. That goes in favor of SP and BSP, and then it comes to Congress. Right. So Congress, even if it feels like its main politicians from UP, it's their home ground, the home battleground, and they know that they can very convincingly win from there, as it is applicable in case of Modi, who knows that he can very easily win from Varanasi. So I guess they are not making very strong statement by fielding their main leaders from Uttar Pradesh.
So in the final polling days, how the competition is going to fan out in the state? Is it going to be a bipolar or multipolar competition?
It has always been in Lok Sabha elections. It has always been a multipolar competition in UP, because if you kind of very vaguely divide Uttar Pradesh into 4 regions, so there is one particular party that spearheads one region. So it is the case, and it has been a trend that has been following since decades. So if you talk about the eastern Uttar Pradesh, like places like Varanasi, Allahabad, and Gorakhpur, these are all BJP bastions, and people like Murli Manohar Joshi and Yogi Adityanath, and they all have been winning seats for BJP consistently. So making a big difference, and then there is this other young party, 1-year-old party. So AAP is going to cut down some of the other votes for some of the other parties. So I guess it will still be a 4-cornered match, and AAP won't be making any big impact in Uttar Pradesh. Even if like Arvind Kejriwal contesting from Varanasi, I guess it's more than a political gimmick for Aam Aadmi Party.
So let's hope that the elections in UP will be as interesting as always. Thank you so much for joining us on the show, Piyush.
We'll now move on to the South Indian state of Tamil Nadu.
From the northern state, which has been always exciting and influential in the general elections, we'll come to the southern state of Tamil Nadu, which is as interesting and as dynamic as Uttar Pradesh. Let's take a look at the state.
Tamil Nadu, which has 39 Lok Sabha seats, has a dominant role to play in national politics. The top national political parties, namely the Congress and the BJP, have very little presence in the present scenario, as it is the regional parties DMK and AIADMK which hold the cards. The Congress party, which lost its ground in 1969, did not attract any traction since then. The Dravidian movement, led by popular commentators E.V. Ramaswamy Periyar and Karunanidhi, led to a huge political turnout in the state, which between the two national alliances, NDA and UPA, has nothing much to offer from the two regional parties, as these parties have planned to go independent.
We have with us in the studio Siddharth Prabhakaran, correspondent of The Word, who is going to talk more about Tamil Nadu. Siddharth, the Dravidian parties, they've always been part of the coalition government in the pre-polls, okay? But this time, they're standing alone. They aren't having any alliance with any of the national parties. Will this have a drastic impact on the state's face of politics?
I don't really think that it's going to have a drastic impact, and I don't think it was for an impact. ADMK's leader, Jayalalitha, clearly has prime ministerial ambitions. She feels that if she wins more than, like, say, 30 seats, 39 plus 1 Pondicherry out of 40, if she wins 80%, 30 seats, she feels she's a clear contender for prime minister. It's another fact that she feels she's going to win all 40 and then surely becomes a prime ministerial candidate. DMK doesn't have a partner because it doesn't want to align with the Congress, and no, it doesn't have anyone, but it has gotten all the minority parties, Indian Muslim League and Manidharya Makkal Katchi, along with it, and it has joined a part. So I don't, as far as history goes, as you said, it has always been in coalition with one of the national parties, but this time it hasn't. There are still talks that ADMK might join with BJP in a post-poll alliance because of ideological similarity between ADMK and BJP. But on the field, the local BJP leaders aren't, they're not looking at Amma. They want any party that is aligning with them. They want that party to recognize Modi as the prime ministerial candidate. But with Jayalalitha openly showing prime ministerial ambitions, there is a clear tussle between BJP and ADMK.
Right. So that, since you mentioned Jayalalitha's prime ministerial ambitions, and it's been a very clear projection of those ambitions throughout. Do you think the ADMK will be able to register that kind of a performance which gives Jayalalitha the push to project herself as a prime minister from the third front, if at all the third front comes?
Siddharth, you have to look at the history of voting in Tamil Nadu. For example, 2 elections back, DMK swept the polls, the Lok Sabha polls totally. Yeah. ADMK did not win even 1 seat. If you see the 2009 polls, this is when DMK was in power at the state. It again won 18 seats. 27 seats was won by the DMK and Congress together, while the ADMK was able to make some headway. If you look now, right now, ADMK is ruling Tamil Nadu, the state, and it has an astounding majority in the 2011 elections. And Amma has also delivered, that is Jayalalitha has also delivered on a lot of promises. So I think right now the mood is pro Jayalalitha, which is another reason why she is gone alone, despite joining hands with the left parties. She went and announced 40 candidates, and then she pulled out of the alliance. So
because so the mood clearly is pro Jayalalitha, which is why she's gone alone, and I think there's a fair chance that she makes good impact. But there are other concerns as well, like DMK and Congress have their loyalists, but overall I think Jayalalitha will be making a strong impact.
Before we continue with you, we'll go for a small video of a village that our correspondents had covered. A village in which the people talk about what they want in their leaders.
Thousands of years after Hindu mythological hero Ram built a bridge connecting mainland India to the island country of Sri Lanka, there remains now nothing more than the ruins of the former town of Dhanushkodi. After witnessing a tidal wave in the 1960s, Dhanushkodi has become just a small village with hardly any accessibility of food. Fishing is the only occupation of the village. Pandi is a local fisherman who struggles hard to survive in Dhanushkodi. He blames the government for the existing problems.
இப்போ நான் வந்தது நேற்று வந்தேன். நேற்றுக்கு ஒரே ஒரு வீட்டில் கொஞ்சம் சோறு இருந்தேன். சொல்ல கேளுங்க. ஒரு நாளைக்கு 24 மணி நேரம் 24 மணி நேரம் 3 நேரத்தில் பசிக்கும்ல. ஒரு நேரம் தான் சாப்பிட்ருக்கேன், இப்போ சாப்பிட்ருக்கேன். அப்போ 2 நாளைக்கு 2 தடவை சாப்பிட்ருக்கேன். அப்போ சாப்பிட்டா இன்னைக்கு இந்த சாப்பாடு நான் உழைச்சி கொடுத்தா தான் என் புள்ள குட்டியை சாப்பிடும். அது எத்தனை நாள் பட்டினியாக கிடக்கும். இப்போ நான் போகிறதுக்கு சாயங்காலம் ஆயிரும். போட எங்கள் வீட்டில் சோறு நாளைக்கு தான் சாப்பிட முடியும். இப்படி தான் நாங்கள் வாழ்ந்துக்கிட்டு இருக்கோம். அதுக்கு இந்த ரோடு வசதி இருந்தால் தான் இந்த மக்கள் நல்லா வாழும். மாதிரியா இருக்குது இந்த நாட்டில் இந்த ஊரில் நடக்கிறது இதுதான். இப்போ ஸ்ரீலங்கா 12 கிலோமீட்டர் இருக்கிறனால இங்கேருந்து மீன் பிடிக்க அங்கே போக முடியாமல் இருக்க முடியாது. இப்போ இது வந்து நெட்டுன்னு சொல்கிறாங்கல்ல, இங்கிலீஷில் மட்டும் ஹிந்தியில் நெட்டா இங்கிலீஷு நம்ம 2 மொழிலையும் வருது. அந்த நேரத்தில் நெட்டு அங்கே விட்டோம்னா நீ வருஷாலும் தண்ணிக்கு அங்கே தான் போகும். இந்த காற்றுக்கு அங்கே போயிடும். எங்கள் பாடலில் அங்கே மீன் விட்ட வலை விட்டோம்னா அந்த பக்கம் போயிடும். நாங்கள் பிடிச்சி காலையில் பிடிக்க போகும்போது அவன் ஏரியாவில் போயிடும். அவங்க ஏரியாவில் வந்து இந்த ஏரியாவுக்கு வந்து மீன் பிடிப்பாங்க. இது வந்து மீனவனுக்கு வந்து எல்லை கூட கிடையாது. இது ஸ்ரீலங்கா மீன், இது இந்தியா மீன் எழுதியா இருக்குது மீனில் கிடையாது. கொடுவான மீனவர்கள் மாதிரி ஒரு கஷ்டம் யாருக்குமே கிடையாது. மனுஷ பிறப்பில் பிறக்கவே கூடாது. பாருங்க, இந்தியாவில் பிறந்தது இது வந்து வேஸ்ட்டானது தான். இந்தியன் அரசாங்கம் என்ன செய்யுது மீனவர்களுக்கு? இன்றைக்கி வந்து இந்திய நாட்டில் வந்து மீனவரும் விவசாயிகள் இல்லாட்டால் நாடே கிடையாது. இவங்க இல்லையே, உங்களை மாதிரி அதிகாரியும் அரசுகளுக்கும் கரெக்டாக நீங்கள் வந்து உங்கள் வாழ்க்கைக்கு மட்டும் பயன்படுத்தி சரியாக இருந்துக்கிறீங்க. மற்றவங்க இருக்கிறாங்களா இல்லையா அப்படின்ட்டு மொத்தத்தில் மீனவர்கள் விவசாயம் வச்சு தான் வாழ்க்கையே இருக்குது. உங்களுக்கு விவசாயம் பண்ண தெரியுமா? தெரியாது. நாங்கள் விவசாயம் பண்ணால் தான் உங்களுக்கு ரைஸ் கிடைக்கும். மீன் பிடிச்சா தான் உங்களுக்கு நல்ல சாப்பாடு உணவுலாம் கிடைக்கும். எங்களுக்கு அது போக முடியலையே. நாங்கள் எப்படி உங்களுக்கு கிடைக்கும்? உங்களுக்கு சாப்பாடு கொடுக்க முடியாது. அந்த சூழ்நிலைக்கான அவங்களுக்கு வந்து வெளி உலகத்தில் அங்கிட்டு படிப்புனால வச்சுக்கிட்டு மக்களை ஏமாத்துற மாதிரி தான் படித்தவங்க செய்கிறது எனக்கு தெரியுது. படிக்காதவங்களை வந்து படித்தவங்க ஏமாற்றி தான் வாழ்ந்துக்கிட்டு இருக்காங்க. படிக்காதவன் கீழே போய்கிட்டு இருக்கான், படித்தவங்க மேலே போய் பல நாட்டுக்கெல்லாம் பறந்து போகிறாங்க.
Coming back to the discussion, Siddharth, we see that BJP is having a much stronger hold than before. DMDK, PMK, MDMK, they're all forming an alliance with BJP. And will BJP be a strong contender for the Dravidian parties like ADMK and DMK?
Akshaya, if you look at the coalition in that, the biggest party is Vijayakant's DMDK. 14, it is going to contest in 14 seats. Compared to that, BJP has only 8 seats. You have to realize that, you have to ask why this is such, because DMDK polled 10.3% of votes in the last Lok Sabha elections. So clearly it is DMDK which has formed an alliance with PMK and BJP. It is not the other way around. BJP is again trying...
Siddharth, in the national equation, it's ultimately the BJP which will be the face of the government.
Exactly.
Right?
It is trying to garner as much votes as possible, as many seats as possible in the state. It was looking at Jayalalitha, which was a possible ally. They didn't get, so they went to the biggest party, that is DMDK.
Right.
Whether it will do, whether this Rainbow Alliance will do well, DMDK is again, it has popularity, but it is on the wane. It will poll good votes. PMK, out of 7 seats, it is always done. It's a strong party in its area. It is a caste-based party 1 year. So yeah, decently okay. I don't really know how well, but it won't do that well as it wants to.
To know as to what role Tamil Nadu will play in these general elections, we spoke to Mr. Arunachalam Venkatraman,
correspondent the New Indian Express.
Let's see what he has to say.
have a large impact because, every time you see Tamil Nadu, regional parties in Tamil Nadu have not had a very huge role to play in the center. Of course, they've had a huge role to play with DMK having 28 seats in the previous this thing and stuff. But usually it gets split, to a large extent it gets split. So this time that won't be there because, the ADMK seems to be coming up very strongly and they are hoping, they're aiming for a stand at the center. It has not been there before. Be it the DMK or the ADMK, they've never fought for a place in the center before. They've never had aims for the center before, but this time that is not the case. ADMK is aiming for the center and it's very clear about that. So I think this will have a huge impact in the center and whatever, if the ADMK gets the seats it's aiming for, it will definitely not get 40, but whatever seat it gains, it will still have a bigger say in the center. And, one of the most important things to look at is the post-election alliances that the ADMK is going to look at. So that will play a huge role in, how much power and how much pull the regional party is going to have in the center.
So Siddharth, final thoughts on Tamil Nadu's role in the general elections?
The mandate is clear. My opinion, it's clearly going to be in Jayalalitha's favor. What kind of post-poll alliances she creates it will impact the national scene.
And the possibility of any sorts of alliance cannot be ruled out?
No, it can't be. With Jayalalitha or Karunanidhi, it can't be ruled out.
Okay.
Thank you,
well, thank you so much for joining us on the show today.
Thanks a lot.
We'll now head into a short break, but on the other side of the break, we have a lot more for you. Stay tuned. Continuing with our southern states of India, we'll now move on to the next state, which comes in the top 3 states in terms of number of seats contributed to the Lok Sabha. We'll move to Andhra Pradesh and take a look at the profile of that state.
The state of Andhra Pradesh is one of the big players that decides the formation of central government in the 16th Lok Sabha election. With 23 districts, it is one of the biggest states in India, which constitutes for 42 seats out of the 543 seats in the lower house of the Indian Parliament. The major contenders in this election are the United Progressive Alliance, National Democratic Alliance and the Third Front. These alliances are led by 4 strong regional parties of the state. They are Congress, Telugu Desam Party, YSR Congress Party and Telangana Rashtra Samiti. This was the vote share of the United Progressive Alliance in 2004 and 2009. The National Democratic Alliance had this vote share. And the Third Front? This Lok Sabha elections will be the last Indian general election in the United Andhra Pradesh, as the state is now bifurcated into Telangana and Seemandhra. The polling will be held on April 30th in Telangana region and on May 7th in Seemandhra region. The 15th Lok Sabha general elections are going to be held in 2 phases in Andhra Pradesh. The first phase on 30th of April 2014 and the second on May 7, 2014. The elections will be held in 17 constituencies in Telangana region and 25 constituencies in Seemandhra region. According to the latest survey conducted by a national magazine, the estimated vote share of the parties are as follows. And we will soon get a clear picture on Andhra Pradesh politics.
That was a really fairly comprehensive coverage of the state of Andhra Pradesh from our correspondents Jayant and Rajita.
Right now we have with us MV Saumitri, who's going to give us an insight about the state in a much detailed way.
Saumitri is correspondent with The Word. Welcome to the show, Saumitri.
Hi.
So Saumitri, we had a bifurcation of Andhra into Seemandhra and Telangana. So tell us, how is this going to impact the current elections?
Well, I think the important thing to remember here is that for a very long time, the state that used to be Andhra Pradesh, was very important to the Congress. It used to be a stronghold for the Congress. It used to be where they got the most number of seats, which means that after the bifurcation, the most important thing for the national stage is how is it going to affect the number of seats that the Congress gets and is sure of. And the short answer is that it makes life very difficult for the Congress. What has happened is that in 2009, the Congress leader who was the chief minister of the state died in a helicopter crash. And his son then became sort of leader in his father's place. And this created a number of complications for the Congress. What that's meant is that there has been a huge fragmentation in terms of Andhra Pradesh politics. And many commentators say that if that crash had not happened, if Y.S. Rajashekar Reddy had not died, the bifurcation simply would not have taken place. The most important thing to look at is how this bifurcation is going to roll out in terms of those seats for the Congress.
Was the bifurcation move just the Congress's initiative to pull in more votes in the state?
Not at all. So there was a move towards bifurcation. Just very quickly, the reason the bifurcation is happening, of course, is an identity issue. So in the 60s, 70s, and 80s, since then, there's been a move to separate Telangana from the state of Andhra Pradesh. But after Y.S. Rajashekar Reddy died, the Congress began to see that the best way for them to salvage the seats and take them away from Y.S.R. Rajashekar Reddy's son was to separate out the state and then try and salvage some of those seats. So it's not at all, so the Congress made that decision, but the political movement which was held, which was sort of championed by the another party, the Telangana Rashtra Samiti, has been there for a very long time.
I'd like to tell our viewers that Andhra Pradesh is the state which has the city of Hyderabad, one of the leading cities in the country. And Hyderabad has been the bone of contention, Saumitri, since it's the proposed joint capital of both states. And how will the bifurcation of the united Andhra into Telangana and Seemandhra play for the political parties in the state? Because it will completely change the dynamics for the upcoming elections.
Yeah, exactly. So then very quick, there are four parties then in Andhra Pradesh currently. There's the Congress, there's the YSR Congress, which is now separate from the Congress. There's the Telangana Rashtra Samiti, which championed the Telangana cause. And then there's the Telugu Desam Party, which was very anti-Telangana. The problem becomes when you split the state and you have no centralized capital, you don't know where that capital is going to be. The political parties themselves don't know where to focus their political power, where to focus their manpower. For example, until last week, the talk was that the Telugu Desam Party, which was anti-Telangana, was largely defeated in that region because they didn't support bifurcation. But they've recently found that in the suburbs of Hyderabad, there are a large number of voters from the Andhra part of the state who are still willing to vote for the Telugu Desam Party. So these sorts of things are still coming up. We're still discovering who the electorate are. And that's going to be very important to the center in the next few months.
But if you see, the local media show that the TDP, that is the Telugu Desam Party, is on a rise, while the national medias project YSR's Congress as a much dependent candidate. So,
well, I think it's important to remember that there are now two regions. So, what I was talking about previously, the TDP's rise is happening in the Telangana region, whereas this YSR Congress party is very strong in the other region, the Andhra region, which means that to some extent the coverage is sort of not really contradicting each other. It's just a question of not really looking at the details. While the YSR Congress is projected to be incredibly popular in the Andhra region, despite a sort of tacit acceptance that that party is hugely corrupt. So it's really quite startling in some senses to see how strong that party is in the Andhra region.
Given the extreme dynamics of the state of Andhra Pradesh, to get into further nuances of the state, we spoke to Mr. Sai Shekhar,
editor newsfi.com, and here's what he had to say.
Yeah.
Andhra Pradesh played a very vital role in 2009 because it elected 33 MPs on behalf of the Congress. Whereas this time the Congress may not win more than 5-6 seats out of 42. So Andhra Pradesh will not rally behind the Congress and it will go along with the trend across the country which looks to be very fractured.
Saumitri, so BJP-TDP alliance, is it possible? Is it going to work out there?
Well, it's an interesting question. So, the Bharatiya Janata Party has been traditionally extremely weak in the Andhra Pradesh region. But recently, we've sort of seen steps, just like they're taking steps in Tamil Nadu, steps in Andhra Pradesh to try and get seats. But as we were just discussing, the TDP is suddenly sort of becoming more confident about its own prospects, which means that it's now reconsidering whether it needs that alliance at all, and wants to negotiate from a position of strength, which means that this alliance, which until last week seemed very strong, suddenly in the last week with these new revelations about the vote, is becoming much weaker. It's still very much in flux. Maybe next week the alliance will be back on, but for now it really seems like the TDP feels like it doesn't need an ally at the center to be a player in the center.
So basically, Saumitri, around this election, Andhra Pradesh will also be breaking the trend. It's been seen as a state which goes with the Congress. One of the states which Congress can easily rely upon in terms of sheer strength in the Lok Sabha. So it will be breaking the trend, right? This time.
Very much so. And it puts the Congress in a difficult position because it also lost Delhi this year. And it means that now, because they've lost Delhi and they're going to lose Andhra Pradesh, for the center, Andhra Pradesh now becomes much more politically contentious than it ever was. And historically, it's not gotten much attention in terms of like policies from the center. Experts are projecting that will now have to change if people want those seats at the center, if politicians want to be taken seriously.
So what is the influence of Jan Sena, Lok Satta and Kiran Kumar Reddy's party, which were all...
Basically those parties which are concentrated in the state.
Well, essentially, they're not going to be very important unless they gain a critical mass of seats. They need to get 10, 12 seats if they want to have a say at the center. And so far, they've had maybe one, maybe two. They are still very much fledgling parties that don't seem to have grown beyond that. And as a result, it's going to be very difficult for them to be heard in the state or in the center.
Just a quick comment. The ex-CM of Andhra Pradesh, Kiran Kumar Reddy, who resigned after Telangana was created and floated his own new party. Do you think he'll benefit from the sympathy that he might have gained because of resigning?
I think it's difficult because anyone who might have been sympathetic to his cause is already keen on voting for Y.S. Rajshekhar Reddy's son. So it's very difficult for him to gain any sympathy from that same electorate.
Great. Well, thank you for coming on the show, Saumitri, and we'll be looking forward to the elections in Andhra Pradesh, and the continuous coverage will be on ACJ News. Now, from the southern states of India, we'll move to the western region, one of the prosperous states of the country, Maharashtra. Let's take a look at the profile of the state by Omkar Gokhale.
Maharashtra, a western state of India, is one of the prosperous and populous states. It has the highest GDP and tax payment to national exchequer. Maharashtra stands second to Uttar Pradesh, with 48 constituencies among the electorally important states. Maharashtra has two metro cities, Mumbai and Pune, and maximum number of second-tier cities, including Nasik, Aurangabad and Nagpur. But it also has some of the most backward districts and drought-prone areas in the country. Large number of farmer suicides in recent years has been a paradox in the state, which consists of 39 of India's top 100 millionaires. The state has been a stronghold of ruling Congress party for several decades. However, the anti-incumbency factor against Congress-led state government and BJP's wider alliance with parties including Shiv Sena, Republican Party of India, may threaten the current ruling combination. These two factors might play a key role in government formation at the center.
To elaborate more on Maharashtra politics, we have with us Omkar Gokhale, correspondent of ACJ Newsline. Welcome to the show. So Omkar, if you see, Congress party has always been having a strong hold in Maharashtra. Do you think with all these corruption charges and various issues that have been going around in the name of the Congress, will Congress still be coming back to power in Maharashtra?
No, I would like to clarify one thing, that Congress, as far as the general elections are concerned, for the last 3 elections, Congress has never been never had the stronghold in Maharashtra, because the Congress-led United Progressive Alliance and BJP-led National Democratic Alliance, the vote percentage between two alliances in Maharashtra was just between 4 to 5%. So the Congress doesn't get the stronghold in Maharashtra. But considering the anti-incumbency factor against the state government, which is again led by the Congress, and the union government, which is led by UPA, United Progressive Alliance, it gives clear edge to National Democratic Alliance, which in Maharashtra, which includes Shiv Sena, Bharatiya Janata Party, and Republican Party of India, which is led by Ramdas Athavale. It clearly gives them the edge over the current incumbent government.
But then, Omkar, will Congress's loss directly translate into BJP, Shiv Sena, RPI's gain? Is that straight a equation this time?
No, yeah, that's very interesting scenario. We have earlier for the last election we had 4 major parties, including Shiv Sena, Bharatiya Janata Party, Congress, and Rashtrabadi Congress, and Maharashtra Navnirman Sena, which was added later. And now we have Aam Aadmi Party. So it has become multipolar election when it is about Maharashtra. So even if the Congress's vote share gets reduced, these parties will bank upon that particular vote share. And again, it will be very interesting to see how the 48 seats, which give the second largest status to the Maharashtra, considering the electorally important states. These two parties, and including Maharashtra Navnirman Sena and Aam Aadmi Party, they'll snatch away some of the anti-incumbency factor from Bharatiya Janata Party and Shiv Sena. Still, the Congress's performance, which was allegedly very weak in Maharashtra for the last 5 years, which will still give some hope for Bharatiya Janata Party and Shiv Sena. But as a large picture, the Congress will definitely be on the back foot.
We'll continue with these questions, but before we do that, as we mentioned at the beginning of this discussion, Maharashtra is one of the prosperous states in the country, and it has got a very long coastline. Our correspondents visited the Konkan region of Maharashtra, the west coast, and visited the fishermen community there. We'll find out what the fishermen community in Maharashtra and in that region of Konkan goes through. Let's take a look at the story.
Nate is a small village located in the Ratnagiri district of Maharashtra state in western India. Fishing is the main occupation of the village. But the fishermen community is worried about its future because of a proposed nuclear power plant in Jaitapur. It is close to the village. Abdul Sattar Saekar, a 55-year-old fisherman, lost his son in the agitations against the plant.
अठरा असं आहे की जेव्हा तिकडे गडबड झाली पोलीस स्टेशनला
18th of April in 2011, all of us heard that the police had arrested some anti-nuclear protesters and we rushed there.
त्यावेळेला ते बाई माणसाला गेले ना पोलीस स्टेशनला बघायला, त्यावेळेला पोलिसांनी असं केलं आणि
There was huge commotion there and the police charged on all of us. During all this, my son Tabrez, who was standing in a corner, was shot by one of the policemen.
आणि नंतर परत काय झालं, तिकडे पोलीस गेल्यानंतर समजलं ते पळाले पुढे गेल्यानंतर समजलं ते आमचं तबरेज.
The person who went to help him was shot in his ears and so he ran away. Though the officials offered treatment for my son, he was dead and we heard this news only from the TV news channels.
त्याच्या पण गोळी मारला ते आमच्याकडे आम्ही घेऊन झालो आणि मध्ये जाऊन
I really feel that the police have cheated me in this issue.
झाला म्हणून तबरेज साहेब म्हणजे किती पोलीस लोकांनी धोका दिला आहे बघा आम्हाला.
Like him, there are several other fishermen who struggle to earn a living.
So Omkar, Aam Aadmi Party is being moving from Delhi to different other parts of the country. So Maharashtra is also one of their major focuses, and they've been contesting people like Medha Patkar and Meera Sanyal. So what do you think? Will AAP have a great future in Maharashtra?
No, even when Aam Aadmi Party was formed in Delhi and Haryana, their third target was Maharashtra, because Maharashtra has largest number of cities in India, which includes Mumbai, Pune, Nagpur, and Nasik and all.
Mm.
And when it comes to Medha Patkar and Meera Sanyal, it shows how Aam Aadmi Party has given the diversified candidates list.
Right.
Meera Sanyal belonging to the corporate entity, Medha Patkar belonging to the activist activism. But the interesting fact is Meera Sanyal belongs to the South Mumbai constituency, and Mukesh Ambani, one of the richest Indians, he also belongs to the same constituency. So it will be interesting to see whether Mukesh Ambani, who is supposedly he's industrial baron, he'll vote for Meera Sanyal or he'll go for other parties. It will be interesting to see that. And these kind of equations in Maharashtra, considering the rural divide and urban divide, which give the character to the state, which has diversified electoral outcomes.
Will it play out completely differently, the urban and the rural voting?
Yeah, it has been there since last 2-3 decades, because earlier when Congress had the stronghold in 80s or 90s, most of the regions in Maharashtra, they were held by Congress. Right. But in last 2-3 elections, Aam Aadmi Maharashtra Navnirman Sena, Aam Aadmi Party, and even Rashtravadi Congress, which is Nationalist Congress Party, they are getting momentum in urban areas like Mumbai, Pune, Nasik. Right. And even one of the important regions, which is one of the backward districts, it includes one of the backward districts in India, which is Vidarbha. The BJP-led National Democratic Alliance is getting momentum in that particular area, considering the criticism against current government. So there will be clear divide between.
Right. Yeah. We spoke to Mr. Ashish Dikshit,
Deputy News Editor for
IBN
Lokmat.
And we tried to know from him how Maharashtra will fare out in these elections.
Here's what he had to say.
It will be difficult for Congress and NCP to maintain the same kind of results that it had produced in 2009, because first of all, NCP seems to be suffering a lot, and the survey which we recently did with CSDS showed that NCP is doing poorly, especially in the western Maharashtra, which is considered to be a stronghold of the party. So, since its alliance partner is doing so badly, and also Congress itself is not doing so well in urban areas of Maharashtra. So it is likely that Congress will lose around 5 to 6 seats, and NCP will lose the same amount of seats in Maharashtra. So the total tally of Congress NCP might go down by around 10 seats, and that will be the gain for the Shiv Sena BJP combined.
So, can we expect any last-minute surprises from Maharashtra?
Last-minute surprises. The current condition is Maharashtra is parties like NCP and Congress, they have projected new candidates which are nothing but the state ministers.
Right.
So they might gain the national picture from this particular election. And yeah, that's it.
But the trends are going to be broken this time.
Yeah, the train will be in favor with National Democratic Alliance, which will be the national train, supposedly.
Right.
So, I think that's all from
Thanks for joining us on the discussion today.
And that's all from
the
election
desk.
That's all we have
from the election desk.
You will have Rajita and Anshu taking more on for the general stories.
welcome back. You're watching ACJ News India. Anshu, do you think we have told our viewers quite a lot about elections now?
Yes, I mean, we've covered the election process, the voting rights, and especially the major state politics in the country.
So I think maybe it's time to move on to the problems faced by people who are going to vote in these elections now. I mean, it's these problems that cause unrest, and in the wake of the upcoming elections, they gain more significance because after all, a new government means new solutions and new hopes.
Yes, and as you earlier mentioned, Rajita, the very special aspect about this country is that because of the existence of different landscapes, there are different people living in regions which have different problems and different conditions. For example, ironically last year, Uttarakhand had flash floods while Chitradurga suffers from water shortage.
Chitradurga is a city in the state of Karnataka in India. The place is prone to droughts. Chitradurga's population is illiterate, and majority of them do not go to school,
Yes.
and even the minority that does just completes primary education. These people are struggling to make a living. Our correspondent Utatya Nag travelled through the region and captured the faces of the people there through his lens.
Deprivation is not about some random set of numbers or stats. It's about people. Poverty is definitely not a state of mind, but it certainly reflects in the eyes of the deprived. This collage of random faces is not a story of numbers or 2 counts of missed meal. It's a tribute, a salute to the people of Chitradurga who call life what we quantify as deprivation.
The hopes and aspirations reflected on the faces of the people of Chitradurga point out an important fact. Keeping dreams alive in abject poverty is not an easy task and a very brave thing to do.
Definitely. There are many other places like Chitradurga which are neglected and need immediate attention. The northeastern state of Meghalaya is an example. Meghalaya is a very beautiful place and it's called the abode of clouds. But the people living there have been facing poverty for the last 2 decades. Our correspondent Atisha Jain looks at the problem faced by a village in Meghalaya.
Nestled in the northeastern state of Meghalaya, which means abode of clouds, Kongthong is a small village in the East Khasi district. With its precipitous ravines and panoramic views from hilltops, Kongthong is a perfect example of virgin beauty and splendor. The sounds of roosters crowing, birds tweeting, and broomgrass rustling fill the air. The steaming cup of lal cha warms the spirits dampened by the chilly weather, as does the fire burning on the stone hearth in every household. Children are seen playing happily while their parents leave for working in fields. Apart from the unique matrilineal system in the Khasi tradition, where the mother is the head of the property, people of Kongthong have the unique feature of calling their children not by names but by sounds or lullabies assigned to them, much like the bird's tweets. But everything is not as picture perfect as it seems. Despite being in the state holding the record for receiving the highest rainfall in the world, the village of Kongthong is reeling under acute water shortage. The people have to depend on the nearby springs and ponds for their daily use and consumption, which in turn involves traveling long distances. As of now, there is no proper mechanism in place for rainwater harvesting in this village. The people, however, have an ingenious system of tapping stream and spring water by using bamboo pipes. Owing to the terrain of the region and the lack of roads, connectivity is a huge problem. Therefore, the only mode of transportation is on foot. Initiatives have, however, been taken by the local villagers to transport materials from one village to another. Thatched cottages made with plank or stone walls and raised on a plinth some 2 to 3 feet from the ground intersperse the lush greenery of the village. Apart from cemented pathway built under the Narega scheme, rough steep stone steps lead from one house to the other. Most of the houses have a small fenced patch of land for growing oranges, lemon, ginger, pumpkin, betel leaf, either for the household use or for commercial purpose. Thus, the greater proportion of the population subsists by cultivation. Broomgrass cultivation, however, remains the main occupation of the people of Kongthong. The broomgrasses are then sold at the Krang market, some 4 kilometers away from Kongthong. Kongthong is considered the most literate village in the area, comprising 40 to 45 small villages. With 3 schools in the village, almost all children, both boys and girls, are enrolled in one of the 3. However, one of the major issues is the lack of facilities for higher education.
One of the major issues affecting the northeastern states is connectivity. However, the problem of connectivity can be solved by providing better railway services. But it often happens that many people who work in the railway services for the betterment of our lives are taken for granted. For example, the contractual laborers who work in the railways industry. Therefore, these people work for the betterment of our lives, but we don't value their services, because of which they face a lot of exploitation. Our correspondents Vivek and Vishak bring you the story on the contractual laborers in the railways industry.
On the occasion of Women's Day, we tried to document the plight of women labourers who have no idea about the nascent movement for the upliftment of women that is transpiring in the rest of the country. These women who work in shifts are seen as being exploited by the government by many, as they remain unaware of the labour laws that they are entitled to. These labourers who used to work as permanent government employees are now employed as contract labourers. This means that they are not entitled to any government benefits or incentives that come with a government job. Most of these women are afraid to express their grievances, as they are afraid of being threatened by higher authorities. These women are engaged in the profession of cleaning platforms, railway tracks and toilets for hours at a stretch for a wage that does not suffice for their daily needs. There are major discrepancies in the wages of these women labourers, where some state their wage as being 4,000 rupees per month, others state it as being 6,000. The massive disinvestment process of the government in the last 2 decades has led to the loss of lakhs of permanent jobs and an increasing reliance on the private sector. there seems to be no common platform for these women to address their grievances other than the trade unions who claim to work for the betterment of their lives. The unions claim that they work hard to ensure basic benefits reach these employees, but they have their own limitations.
Afraid of being threatened by higher authorities.
எத்தனை பேர் வரும் எல்லாம் கூட டோட்டலாக எத்தனை பேர் வரும் எத்தனை வரும் எத்தனை ஷிஃப்ட் இது 3 ஷிஃப்ட் நைட் ஷிஃப்டா நைட் ஷிஃப்ட் உங்களோட சேலரி உங்களுக்கு கிடைச்சது கம்மியாக தான் அது உங்களுக்கு கம்ப்ளைண்ட் பண்ணல யாருக்கும் அது தேவையாவது 10,000 உள்ளுக்கு ஒரு மாசம் 4,200 அது உங்களுக்கு மதியம் தேவை அது உங்களை வீட்டில் அது எந்த உங்களுக்கு யூனியன் மெம்பர்ஷிப் வேணும் இல்லை உங்களை ഈ വിഷയം அவங்க யாரெങ്കിലും പറഞ്ഞിരുന്നോ നിങ്ങളുടെ റെയിൽവേ ഓഫീസർ എന്താ யாரெങ്കിലും
The massive disinvestment process of the government in the last 2 decades has led to the loss of lakhs of permanent jobs and an increase in reliance on the private sector. There seems to be no common platform for these women to address their grievances other than the trade unions that work towards the betterment of their lives. The unions claim that they work hard to ensure basic benefits reach these employees, but they have their own limitations.
Has outsourced certain activities like platform cleaning, coach cleaning, building maintenance, all that. Vendors are called for, and it is being contract. So the whole contract is in this contract workers, and they are paid through the contractors. And the railway does not ensure new wages, working conditions, other problems regarding the contract.
Thousands of women work as contract laborers at the Chennai Central Railway Station, who engage in cleaning tracks, toilets and platforms. With the government increasingly privatizing certain sectors of the railways, thousands lose their jobs as permanent employees. The government claims that they are not responsible for the deplorable condition in which these laborers work, as they have outsourced their jobs to private agencies. With no one to take responsibility, their complaints fall on deaf ears.
It's really unfair how people treat the weaker sections of the society. And these weaker sections would be desperate and they'll take up any job that they get, even though they know that they are being treated unfairly.
True.
An example of the weaker sections are the tribal communities. India has more than 300 tribal communities right now. These tribal communities have their own unique identity and culture, but they face problems like neglect and unemployment. Also, they lose unique traditions with the passing of every new generation. Our correspondent Shruti Shiksha tells you more about the Banjaras, one such tribal community.
Banjaras, the innumerable nomadic tribe, are found largely in Andhra Pradesh, Tamil Nadu, Madhya Pradesh and Karnataka. They originated centuries ago in Rajasthan but originally belonged to Afghanistan. The total population of the Banjaras, or the Lambada community as they are popularly known in India, is 5.6 million. They are known for their distinctive colorful clothing, spectacular jewelry and embroidery. They are also known for their song, poetry and dance. They are accustomed to wearing the costume of ghagra and choli. Ghagra means the full-length skirt with embroidered borders and choli means a blouse. Their head plates are tied together at the end by ghugri and chotla. Ghugri is the big silver round thing and chotla is the smaller one. Wearing of ghugri is a sign that their husbands are still alive. They have the ghunto, also called the ghungat, to cover their heads. It has square mirrors and silver coins put all over it. They keep a potliya or a pouch attached to their ghagra to keep money and other valuable stuff. It has beads of different colors all over it and is made by them in a short period of 4 to 5 days. They wear a chhatri, toe ring and a nut, nose ring on both sides of their feet and nose. They also wear a har, also called necklace, which they wear around the neck. The necklace is encircled with coins. Initially silver coins was used, but due to lack of money they now use simple coins. The married women wear kapoor ki chudi, also called ivory bangles in their hands, which means their husbands are still alive. Men wear dhoti and kurta, specially designed for the protection from harsh climate and also to distinguish themselves from other communities. The doors of their homes are beautifully designed and decorated and is a rare thing to see. They are painted nicely and has a horse face on both the top corners, as it is believed to bring happiness, peace and prosperity in the family. They have a big festival called Poonam Yatra in the month of January, where they worship Lord Durga and offer sacrifice. Their occupation generally is carrying forest products, farming and agriculture. There are also a large number of migrant workers in the community. The younger generation, because of the influence of the modern culture, does not feel the need to carry on with their tradition. According to them, it's awkward and out of fashion to wear such clothes and jewelry. The older people feel that their tradition and rich culture is diminishing at a faster rate and in no time will get extinct.
We will now get back to you after a short break. Please stay tuned.
Welcome back. You're watching ACJ News India with Rajita Menon and Anshu Lal.
Like the Banjaras, there are various other kinds of minority communities in India which need special attention. For example, a democracy needs to pay attention to all its citizens, whether they be a minority or a majority. And a democracy especially needs to pay attention to the people who need special care.
Yes, the people suffering from psychological disorders are one such minority. They face enormous amount of social stigma. But does India actually have enough experts to take care of these people? Our correspondent Akshaya Nath finds out.
Dementia, a state of progressive deterioration of the brain, is an emerging age-related disorder that has been affecting a large population in India. Estimates show that there are around 3.7 million patients suffering from dementia in India alone.
5% of the people above the age of 60 years, generally they develop this sort of a mild cognitive impairment, which can later proceed to what we call as a dementia. Dementia means dementation, the mental faculties. It is not only the memory, the person's ability to think, the person's ability to communicate, his language, and ultimately the personality. That itself will slowly we can see the deterioration. It doesn't happen overnight. It takes its own course. Sometimes it may take years together. Initially people will say he tends to become forgetful.
The most important thing is to get a fully comprehensive history from the patient as well as with the relative roots to the patient. As most of the people now know, memories of things which happen in the last few hours, which we technically call recent memory, that is the first to get affected. So the patient might be misplacing things, searching for things always he had kept and then forgetting where he had left them, asking the same questions again and again. Difficulty in using language. For example, the person might not get the appropriate word used in a conversation, as we call it, the tip of the tongue. These would be some of the early symptoms to start with. Most of the times we'll be able to make a diagnosis using a good clinical history, but it would be much aided by psychological memory cognitive testing as well.
In severe stages of dementia, they forget themselves. They do not know who they are. So the burden will not be on them because he himself doesn't know who or she is not. But the problem is with the caregivers.
Caring the person with dementia is really tough.
It's a really tough job. Of course, we have got 24 hours a day, but we can say that for a person who cares a person with dementia, they do around 36 hours a day. So that much tough job it is.
Scientifically and medically speaking, you need one person to one dementia patient. That's a tool. Caretaker or caregiver should be one individual for one patient. But in reality, it is not happening so. In our group, we have got nearly 13 patients, 13 inmates. Out of them, 4 or 5 will be dementia patients. And we have only this lady. She only take care of everybody.
Still, people are not aware of it. Many people, we have experienced that. We have advertised for a daycare center. We have created a daycare center. But still, people are not coming forward to that. Even though I am getting calls, even for a couple of days back, I received 2-3 calls. They have a 76-year-old mother is there and a 90-year-old father is there. So they want to get them admitted in the residential care center.
There are a lot of nuclear families. So the number of youngsters is shrinking, whereas the number of elderly people, what are called inverted pyramid. Previously, more youngsters will take care of less number of elderly. Now, a lot of elderly will be there, but less number. And then our breakdown of social structure. Always used to have a multi-generational joint families. Now it is descended into nuclear families.
In Kochi itself, I can say that we have got around 100 old age homes. So that itself is a big number, and the old age homes are mushrooming right now. So, and when we just interviewed all these care centers, they just informed that the basic eligibility for entry to this care centers is not having dementia. The person is not having dementia. So that difficulty remains in our community and in our state.
The number of people with dementia worldwide is expected to double by 2030 and triple by 2050. With such increasing statistics, the care available for this disorder is lacking in terms of awareness, service, and knowledge. In India, many families with a loved one suffering with dementia cannot find the appropriate care that they need.
Well, this certainly portrays a sad state of affairs. I mean, people who are battling diseases as severe as psychological diseases, especially dementia, should get a lot of support and encouragement, because this is a very courageous thing to do.
Alzheimer's is the most common form of dementia. September 21 is celebrated as World Alzheimer's Day, and I think it's very important to have a day like this so that people overcome the stigma associated with it and come out and speak more.
Yeah. Not only with respect to the stigma attached to the people who are suffering from the disease, but also I believe that the caregivers, the people who support people who are afflicted from psychological diseases, they should be encouraged. This will encourage other caregivers and other people to support victims of psychological diseases.
Definitely. Taking care of people with dementia is not an easy job, and the people who are doing this, they're doing a very noble work. So I think we could start by recognizing this, by respecting them and not running away from them.
Yes, exactly. I mean, it's not like we're asking them to erect statues in their name or something.
Yes, but then statues are a very important and effective way of remembering, like important people.
Important people, yeah.
So, and they are effective and silent reminders of the history of a place.
Yep.
Like the statues in Marina Beach, for example. From literary figures to chief ministers, we have them all there. And that, makes the place more historic, I think.
Exactly. The Marina Beach is the second longest urban beach in the world. It is located in Chennai in the state of Tamil Nadu in India. And outside the beach are located 18 statues in total. 18
statues. That's a lot. So I think, these statues, they add the beauty to the place. Let's go find out more about this.
Yes, our correspondent Siddhanath Ganu reports on the story.
Every place has its own story built over time. Many characters are involved in writing the story. If you walk down the Marina Beach in Chennai, you'll find the memory of some such characters cast in stone. This statue of Tamil's great poet, Saint Thiruvalluvar, shows him writing Thirukurals, a collection of verses. Beside the statue, there are copies of Thirukurals on a pedestal. Many foreign scholars came to India to study Tamil language. Among them, Constantine Beschi did Italian translations of Tamil literature, and G.P. Pope translated Tamil classics into English. Their statues were erected during the World Tamil Conference in 1968. The leaders who mobilized India for independence are also remembered in this form. Statue of Mahatma Gandhi is located at the main junction of the beach. Close to the statue, a ghat has been named after Lokmanya Tilak. Tilak's close aide, Annie Besant, had a close connection with Madras. Her statue faces the Tilak Ghat. The Triumph of Labour is an artifact created by one of India's legendary sculptors, D.P. Roy Chaudhary. It captures the hard work of labourers. It was one of the first statues on the Marina Beach. These statues have seen the winds of change and have become a source of inspiration for many.
Well, that was a nice way to learn some history.
Yes, and especially without the textbooks. I mean, the inscriptions on the statue tell you what you need to know.
But then that works because there are only few statues there. What would you do if there were structures which numbered up to 200?
200?
200 of different people, different religions, different positions.
Well, that sounds intriguing. And I know the place you're referring to. The Madras War Cemetery was constructed especially for this purpose. It was constructed for commemorating past war heroes.
It's very different from Marina Beach. The people remembered here are war heroes of the First and Second World War.
Even the layout of the place is very different. It's more on the lines of a lawn cemetery, but without graves. There are only plaques giving details of the people buried over there.
Anvesha Ganguly will now show the viewers what we're talking about.
The heritage of Chennai is more than just the Tamilian culture and heritage. The Madras War Cemetery is one of the many war memorials in Chennai. War heroes that died in the First and the Second World War have been commemorated in this cemetery. It is maintained by the Commonwealth War Graves Association. The cemetery was established in 1952. It stands in peaceful silence against the jarring noise of airport traffic in Nandanbakkam. The memory of more than 800 soldiers are preserved within these quaint grounds. Once a year, the kin of the dead and the Commonwealth War Graves Association come together to honor the memory of the soldiers who died in the First and the Second World War. The cemetery is placed 5 kilometers away from the airport. Foreign war heroes are not a major tourist attraction in Chennai. This is perhaps why the cemetery does not get a lot of visitors. The cemetery has 857 graves. These graves belong to soldiers from all around the world. The soldiers were posted in India at the time of their death. They died in various parts of South and East India. Each year, on Armistice Day, their sacrifice is offered. The cemetery is one of the only memorials that still remembers them. A visit to this place reminds us that even though these soldiers are from different countries, they are united in death.
That is a very interesting story. But as the story said, the place doesn't attract a lot of visitors.
That's probably because many people don't know about its existence. And I think that's one of the reasons why the place is still so clean. We are unfortunately a nation of vandals.
Yes, that is true. But I'm definitely going to visit the place. It seems very calm. It's a good break from our hectic schedules.
True, but I like the design of the place more. It looks great. The green background with the white slab placed at equal intervals. You know what it reminds me of? A chessboard.
Yes, that is true. It looks like a giant chessboard. And that in fact would not be out of place in a place like Chennai.
True. After Carnatic music and classical dance, chess is the favorite activity here.
And everybody plays over here, the young and the old. And that has paid off looking at the amount of chess champions that we have produced.
The more the champions, the more inspiration that people derive from them. Our correspondents Sarthak Bal and Tanveer Gogda look at the chess scene in Chennai.
Chess is a huge phenomena in Chennai. Unlike other Indian cities, the awareness and interest for chess is mammoth. The enthusiasm among the people is not recent, as it shares a 66-year-old relation with the city. The present Tamil Nadu Chess Association, formerly known as the Madras Chess Club, was formed on 26 April 1947 at Chennapuri, Andhra Mahasabha, Chennai. It was established to conduct chess tournaments and All India Championships. Until now, it has produced 12 Grandmasters from Tamil Nadu, 3 women Grandmasters, 22 International Masters and 5 Lady International Masters. Among these, the prominent ones are Vishwanathan Anand, 5-time World Champion, Emmanuel Arin, India's first International Master, and S. Vijayalakshmi, India's first Lady Grandmaster. Chess tournaments and academies have existed since the 1980s, but the passion and participation for the sport increased only in the late 80s. During this period, a boy emerged in Chennai and went on to become a legend. His success at the international level encouraged many others to take up the sport. His name is none other than Vishwanath Anand. Vishwanathan Anand, 5-time world champion, is considered to be the main reason for the turnaround of chess in Chennai. Success was never far from him. At the age of 14, he tasted national level success after winning the National Sub-Junior Chess Championship. In 1988, he won the Shakti Finance International Chess Tournament that gave him the status of Grandmaster. The rest is history.
There was no pressure on him at any time. So I didn't see any pressure on him, because when he faced Karpov in Brussels, we were more nervous than him.
Anand has not only inspired people to take up chess, but has also raised the level of the sport and changed their mindset. Such love and adoration for the sport proves that it will keep moving forward.
It won't come as a surprise if another big chess tournament is held in the city.
This is Sarthak Bal and Tanveer Gogda reporting from Hayat Regency.
Although chess is a very popular sport in India, it can be seen that it has a long way to go in terms of the amount of support that it needs from the government and the people. In fact, this can be said about quite a lot of things in India. For example, it's really beautiful that democracy can function so smoothly and easily in a country like India. At the same time, the democratic processes themselves need to be improved, especially with respect to the honesty of the candidates. I mean, if you look at the campaigns right now and the elections right now, there are so many political leaders who have criminal cases against them.
It's because of such people that the common man has lost faith in the democratic process of elections. It's supposed to be a democratic exercise, but now it's turned out to be a test by the people to see whether at least this person will turn out to be good. Let us hope that the new government will address these issues and bring prosperity to India. I'm Rajita Menon.
And I'm Anshu Lal.
Thank you for watching ACJ News India.
Thank you.